Ladies and gentlemen, go for our wild, wild ride with the Honey Badgers. But beware, the sweetest kittens have the sharpest claws. For your own safety, strap yourself in and hold onto something as we enter the Pussycat cast. Taboo topics.
Wait a second. Men are human too.
Marginalized men. Uncomfortable truths. You suck! The Pussycats aren't afraid of heavy lifting.
Good evening and welcome to the Pussycat cast number 9. Justin Trottier and the CCMF. Sorry, that was my phone. This week's verbal Valkyries are our polecat punster turned part-time Pussycat pugilist Hannah and the principled, passionate, plucky, and pleasant Prim Reaper. And of course, the pickle in this small clam bake is myself, the Supreme Doge in Charge. Special thanks, of course, to the CIA for tuning in and listening to our show. And we also have a very special guest. Today we have a writer, nonprofit executive director, and co-founder, as well as executive director of the Canadian Association for Equality. He was heavily involved in CAFE's campaign to open the Canadian Centre for Men and Families in 2014. However, he's not done. He has a new project, which is trying to open the Ottowa branch of the Canadian Centre for Men and Families. Justin Trottier, welcome to the show.
It's always a pleasure to join you.
All right. Well, thanks for coming on. And so could you tell us a little bit about this, your new fundraiser that you're doing here?
We've been, I think, very successful over the last few years in Toronto, operating Canada's first, and I think so far only, men's centre. This is a hub for men's health and social services, everything from Toronto's first support group for male victims of domestic abuse, which is actually gaining a lot of attention in the community, to free mental health services for boys and men, to fathering programs, in particular our flagship program, which is called Fathering After Separation or Divorce, which helps fathers to stay involved and maintain a strong and healthy relationship with their children after a separation or divorce. All that's been very successful over the last few years in Toronto. We think that these programs are vitally important all across Canada, and that in fact we've identified some critical gaps in social services all over the country. So we're looking at Ottawa as our next location. There's lots of families that need help in Ottawa, but Ottawa also is the federal capital, of course, of Canada. And if we can set up a headquarters there, then we can also, I think, do something to combat some disastrous policies that have real-world implications for boys, men, fathers, and families all across the country.
Wow, that you know, it's. I just want to say it's really great that you've been able to get this stuff done. The only men's shelter, right? Is this in North America or just globally that we're looking at?
Well, the one thing we're actually not is a shelter, although we're working on that.
Okay.
We work closely with shelter. We provide a whole bunch of support services to homeless men, a whole bunch of support services to men who are fleeing domestic violence and abuse, and that seek support from shelters. We've got a very strong relationship with a number of shelters in Toronto for both single men and also for father-led families. So if a father and his children have to get out of an abusive home, we're able to support them. But one thing that's a much longer-term, very, very ambitious project, not that we shy away from ambitious projects, is to actually operate our own wholly owned and operated shelter of the Canadian Association for Equality. So we're working on that, and eventually we hope to have one in Toronto and in Ottawa as well. But that is a longer-term project that will take probably another couple years to get off the ground.
All right, so this is currently being done through GoFundMe. I'm going to go ahead and put a display up on the screen.
Yes. Thank you.
Oh yeah, no problem. I want to show people the website here, so just give me a second.
And while you're doing that, let me just explain the context. We've been at this fundraising campaign since the end of 2016, and originally our goal was to reach $50,000 by the middle of 2017. But we're actually ahead of schedule, and in fact, recently we announced that we've surpassed the $50,000 goal. It was always a very modest goal, but we had said if we had reached $50,000, that will trigger the next step. But since we're doing so well, we've actually extended the goal to $75,000. Now the difference is if we can get $75,000, it's going to be a much nicer space. There's going to be much more life-changing services available. And this is the key thing, I think, part of the funding will go to operating the National Advocacy Center, so that being in Ottawa, we can take full advantage of our proximity to federal policymakers. So $75,000 is the difference between having a center providing social services and having all of that, plus being able to do something about these policy issues that I hope we can get into. So yes, if you go to GoFundMe, you will see that we're raising $25,000, and that's to get us to the extended objective of the full $75,000. This will end at the end of May. So if you donate now, your contribution will be doubled, because we've got another donor who's doubling every dollar that comes in, so your funds go further. And if you do it before the end of May, then those funds will go to ensure that we have this advocacy center, which I think is critically important.
So you're saying that some of this gendered policy going on in with the state is really just has a focus on women when they say that. So it's not really very useful. Is that what we're talking about? Like some of these policy issues?
Well, the policies, this is a government that got elected on a platform of being evidence-based, and yet their gender-based budget analysis is the most ideological statement I've ever seen come out of a Canadian government. Point after point, they explain how every fact of the way the way things differ between men and women, how all of it points to how women are disadvantaged. So, for example, they correctly note that 90% of family support payers are men, because roughly 90% of the time that a family breaks up, custody is allocated to the woman. And instead of looking at how that can be changed so that children grow up with both fathers and mothers, which in many cases they don't after a family's broken up, they decide that the real problem is that men aren't paying enough in child support payments. So they're allocating $100 million. $100 million is allocated in this budget to go after typically the father to make sure that he pays more than he's paying right now, instead of putting any money into actually getting at the root of the problem, which is, of course, the family court system, which just dismisses the importance of fathers in the life of a child. There's no interest in equal shared parenting. There's no interest in programs to keep fathers and children connected after a family breakup, the kind of programs that we provide, by the way. All of the funding is going into this very kind of feminist approach to family court, which says that the real culprits, as always, are the men and the fathers who are just not paying enough. So this video is him talking about why he thinks a Center for Men and Families is desperately needed in Ottawa.
Okay, thank you for that. And then after this clip is over, I will let Hannah or Prim speak to what we've talked about so far. And if you guys want to add any questions, those of you in the chat that have questions for Justin, just go ahead and plug them in there, and I will read them out to him. All right, so here we go.
My name is Benjamin Roebuck, and I'm the coordinator of the Graduate Victimology Program at Algonquin College. I'm so happy to be supporting the Center for Men and Families in Ottawa. This center is going to provide vital services to male survivors, and every dollar that you can donate is going to help to create a safe space where men who've experienced trauma can heal and move forward with their lives. Your donation can make a difference.
For those who live in Canada, you're already paying for the women's end of this. You're already funding that because your tax dollars are going towards it. It's the same thing is true in the United States. You're already paying for women's shelters. You're already, quote, donating, end quote, to these through your taxes. So I know there will be some criticism from feminists saying, well, why aren't you doing this genderless? Why is this only for men? Well, this is why. You're already paying for women. You're already funding women. Men and boys cannot get any of that funding because the law treats women as a minority group, even though we're actually, population-wise, we're not. The law treats women as a minority group, and women get funding, and men don't. This is the only way for men and boys to get that funding. And this is why it's important to have an initiative that is strictly for men and boys. I think part of the reason why you guys have been more successful may be also because in the last 5 or 6 years, the men's movement itself and public awareness of men's issues has grown exponentially. And I think part of that, I hate to attribute it to a suicide because it sounds like encouraging suicide. It's not a good reason. There is no good reason for suicide. But I think what Earl Silverman did was bring a huge amount of attention to something that feminists were doing, that feminists should be ashamed of across the board. And that was they did oppose him. They opposed his efforts. They opposed him having money. They tried to throw roadblocks up at every avenue. They went after him with zoning laws. They went after him with everything they could. And I think that they know now that doing that gives critics of feminism a smoking gun to point at. Look, this is what, this is what feminists do whenever people try to help men. And, not to say that it's bad to work with women's organizations to get this done. If it gets it done, that's the important thing. And it is good to have a collaborative effort. And it is good to have means to work within government sources as opposed to butting heads, because you butt heads with the government will smash your head, But I think Earl Silverman's suicide and the resulting media conflict and the resulting discussion between men's rights activists and feminists helped to pave the way for that. So this is, I think it's great that you guys have his picture up, and I think it's great that he's honored. And I think if he could see this, it would really be heartening to him.
Somebody in the chat asked a question. They want to know if you ran into any feminist resistance when you were starting up this men's center or even the previous one.
So this is what's really interesting, is anybody who knows Cafe knows we've run into a lot of resistance, but it's been almost entirely confined to our campus events. So the events I've just talked about, which we're well known for, one of the reasons we're well known for them is because some of them get banned, some of them get moved to different venues at the last minute, some of them have had security fees to pay police because protesters are anticipated, some of them have had riots, not just protests, but riots. I call it a riot when protesters do criminal things like blocking doors, pulling fire alarms, harassing and bullying and intimidating. So all of those things have dogged some of our activities, but it's largely been on campus. The interesting and surprising thing, and very hopeful for me, is that when we shifted to talking about services like mental health programs, therapy, counseling, trauma support, fathering programs, there's been virtually no opposition. Nobody's picketed at the Center for Men and Families, although we feared that they would. In fact, when we looked at locations, that was a consideration, is safety and security around the venue, but that has not been an issue for us. In Ottawa, where we've had some of the most stringent riots and protests, similarly, since we've been talking about opening a center, there's been not even a peep out of protesters opposing the idea of opening a space. And so I think opening a space and providing these life-changing services, it isn't just a good thing to do. It's also strategically, I think, rather wise, because you put your money where your mouth is. One of the criticisms, I don't know that it's that valid, that our opponents say is that all we do is complain. We never actually do anything to change things. It's hard to say that when we're actually day-to-day providing therapy, providing support groups, providing access to lawyers, reconnecting fathers with children. Doing all of these great things to strengthen families and to make communities healthier. It takes the wind out of the sails for these radical feminist protesters.
Men need to know that they can go there for help, and that's
part
it's
of it is
available
messaging it to men. I think that's why we've been successful at getting men to come into the programs. One of the concerns that we heard was, well, what if we fund this and then men just don't go because men don't want to get help? We have been pleasantly surprised. Men want to get help. The problem has been all the negative messaging, all the ways that men get punished, frankly, if they ask for help, if they're vulnerable and they admit that they've been abused, or they admit that they're dealing with depression or mental health issues or whatever. If you change that messaging, if you make it positive and you reinforce that if you come get help, you will be treated with respect and dignity, and that this is a place for men and boys, then people are very willing to access those services.
I know that there are ideologues that wouldn't want to hear about the dynamics of domestic violence as it's known, you know, with more than half of it being initiated by women, and the fact that in most two-way cases, it's women hitting first, and eventually the guy gets past the breaking point and hits back, or he has to defend himself. And a lot of women's injuries in domestic violence situations come from that, because women may be more accepted in being violent, but men are often bigger and stronger. And even though it's a bad thing to be better at, you know, they're better at it, at defending themselves and at dealing damage. And this may significantly reduce the incidence of domestic violence overall, because men who are in that situation where a woman is pushing them past the breaking point, or where they're being abused to the degree that they're going to have to defend themselves or get out, they'll be able to get out. And they won't have to deal with that. So they won't have to confront that situation. And it'll also break that cycle, because they can get... Yeah, and there's another aspect of this. Like, I've watched some of the men in my life, friends that I grew up with from the time they were little boys, where they go from one abusive woman to another. So they get out, but then they don't know how to vet a woman for character. They don't know how to deal with the relationship in terms of, all right, how do I prevent my new relationship from becoming this? And it's a issue of an abuse victim develops behaviors that accommodate the abuser's actions, and they sort of fit into this. Like, codependency is one of those patterns, but there are other patterns that are like that. Yeah. And this will help prevent a lot of that. And in keeping men from being separated from their children, it means you're also keeping dads from being separated from their daughters. And there are numerous ways in which it's documented that a father's influence is vital to a daughter's development. And so there are ways in which you could talk about this benefiting women as well. And although benefiting women is by far not the primary reason for this, it's definitely going to be an outcome. And it just struck me that in talking about the dynamics of abuse and men being able to get out and things like that, that one of the reasons that it's important to work within the system and to work within to work with women's groups, to work with existing domestic violence victims advocacy and so on, even though in terms of in the past stopping this type of initiative, they've been the bad guys, is that it will bring benefit to both sexes, and we may see within a few generations a reduction overall of domestic violence and the circumstances that lead to domestic violence.